His name was Leon Trotsky.
And in January of 1924, he was on a train heading south toward the Black Sea coast on his doctor's orders, trying to recover from a fever that had been dragging on for weeks.
He did not attend Lenin's funeral. That decision, made because he was sick or because he miscalculated or both, would haunt him for the rest of his life. But in January 1924, on that train moving through the Russian winter, he did not yet know how much it would cost him. He was 44 years old. He was the most famous revolutionary in Russia after Lenin himself. He had organized the Red Army almost from nothing. He had won a civil war. He had speeches in him that could move crowds to tears or to action, sometimes both at once. He was brilliant. He was electric. He was admired. He was also, though he did not fully understand it yet, already losing. And the man he was losing to was someone Trotsky had barely bothered to take seriously. Joseph Stalin was 44 years old that same January, the same age as Trotsky, though almost nothing else about them was similar. Where Trotsky was magnetic, Stalin was forgettable. Where Trotsky could fill a room with his presence, Stalin sat in rooms and took notes. Where Trotsky wrote essays that people read and argued about and saved, Stalin wrote memos, internal memos, the kind of document that records who said what, who voted which way, who needs to be reminded of a favor owed. He had been doing this for years. He had been doing it so quietly, so consistently, so far below the level of anyone's attention that by the time Lenin lay dying in his dacha outside Moscow in 1923, Stalin had already become something that looked, from the outside, like a bureaucrat, and was, in fact, something closer to a spider at the center of a web that nobody else had fully seen yet. His official title was General Secretary of the Communist Party. It was a title that, when it was offered to him in 1922, nobody else had wanted. That is worth pausing on. Nobody else wanted it because it sounded like paperwork, like administration, like the kind of job that keeps an organization running but doesn't make history. Other men were competing for positions that sounded important, positions in the Politburo, positions with ideological weight, positions that would put their names in the newspapers alongside their ideas. Stalin took the job nobody wanted. And then he spent 2 years understanding exactly what it meant. What General Secretary actually meant in the Soviet Union of 1922 was this. Stalin controlled the personnel files of every member of the Communist Party. Every appointment, every transfer, every promotion, and every demotion. Every decision about who got sent where, who received which resources, who was elevated to visibility, and who was quietly reassigned to somewhere far from Moscow. In an organization where the party was the state and the state was everything, controlling personnel files meant controlling everything. Not all at once. One name at a time. A loyal man here, elevated to a position he could not have reached on his own. A skeptical man there, transferred to a regional post 3 time zones away where his skepticism would reach fewer ears. No speeches, no confrontations, no dramatic moments. Just files, just decisions, just the slow, patient accumulation of obligation and distance, repeated across hundreds of names over months and years. Lenin saw it. That is the part of this story that most people do not know.
Lenin saw what Stalin was doing, and in December of 1922, while his health was failing and he knew he was running out of time, he dictated a series of notes that his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, carefully recorded. These notes would later become known simply as Lenin's Testament. In them he described the leading figures of the party. Trotsky, he noted, was the most able man in the Central Committee, but too self-confident, too attracted to the purely administrative side of things. And then he wrote about Stalin. Stalin, Lenin wrote, has concentrated enormous power in his hands, and I am not sure he always knows how to use that power with sufficient caution. A few weeks later, after Stalin was rude to Krupskaya on the telephone in a way that infuriated Lenin, he added a postscript. He proposed that Stalin be removed as general secretary. That postscript was written in January 1923. Lenin died in January 1924. His testament, including the postscript, was read to the Central Committee in May 1924. And the Central Committee voted to suppress it. Stalin was present at the meeting. He sat quietly while his colleagues debated whether to destroy the document that could have ended his career. He did not argue. He did not plead. He let other people make the case for him, people who owed him, people he had placed in positions they now occupied, people who understood, without being told, what the right vote was. The testament was buried. Stalin remained General Secretary. And Trotsky, who had read the document and understood what it meant, did something that would define the rest of his life. He said nothing publicly. Not because he was weak, not because he didn't understand the stakes, because he believed, genuinely believed, with the confidence of a man who had never lost anything important, that his own abilities would protect him, that the party would eventually see what Lenin had seen, that time was on his side. He was wrong about every single part of that. The years between 1924 and 1927 are, in the dry language of history, described as a power struggle. That phrase does not do justice to what they actually were. They were a systematic dismantling of a human being. Not physical, not yet. That would come later. In 1924, 1925, 1926, what happened to Trotsky was bureaucratic. His allies found themselves reassigned. His supporters in the military found their reports going to different offices. His speeches were increasingly covered in party newspapers with a particular kind of framing, respectful on the surface, subtly undermining. He would make a brilliant argument in a meeting. The room would applaud. And then, over the following weeks, the people who had applauded would find reasons to distance themselves from the position they had applauded. Not because they had changed their minds, because they had gotten a quiet signal about which way the wind was blowing. Stalin never sent those signals directly. He never needed to. He had spent years building a network of people who understood how to read him and who understood what reading him correctly was worth to their careers. Trotsky kept writing, kept speaking, kept making arguments that were often brilliant and sometimes right. But brilliance and rightness in the system Stalin had built were not the variables that mattered. What mattered was who controlled the apparatus. And Stalin controlled the apparatus. There is a man named Alexander Barmine who left a memoir of this period. He was a Soviet diplomat in the 1920s and early 1930s, a true believer in those early years, the way many people were true believers then. He had fought in the Civil War. He had given years of his life to the revolution. He had stood in the cold outside the Finland station in Petrograd and felt something shift in the world when Lenin stepped off the train. He believed in what it was supposed to be. He describes attending a party meeting in Moscow in the mid-1920s. A routine meeting called for a Tuesday afternoon in a government building that smelled of damp wool and tobacco. Trotsky was scheduled to speak. Trotsky walked in, and the room changed. Barmine writes that even people who had political reservations about Trotsky, and there were many by then, could not help responding to his presence. He was one of those rare people who fill a room when they enter it. Something shifts in the air. Conversations stop mid-sentence. People who were reading their notes look up without deciding to. He was not especially tall. He was 45 or 46 years old, thickening slightly at the middle in the way of men who had once been lean and now sat at desks. His glasses caught the light. He had the kind of face, Barmine writes, that you remembered afterward as more striking than it actually was, because the intelligence behind it made it seem like a different kind of face. Trotsky spoke for 40 minutes. Barmine describes it as one of the finest speeches he ever heard. Clear, analytical, passionate. The case for a different direction for the party laid out with the kind of precision that only someone who had spent years thinking about nothing else could manage. He made 3 arguments that, even in retrospect, Barmine considered essentially correct. When he finished, there was a silence, and then applause. Real applause. The kind that rises from the chest before the mind has decided whether it approves. The kind you cannot manufacture. Barmine looked around the room. He noticed in one corner a man sitting with a notepad who had not applauded, who was writing something down, whose face was perfectly calm. He did not think much about it at the time. And 2 months later, the position Trotsky had argued for was not adopted. The people who had applauded most loudly were, within the year, distancing themselves carefully from the faction they had applauded for. The language Trotsky had used was being quoted in party publications, not to engage with it, but to demonstrate what kind of dangerous thinking needed to be opposed. The applause had meant nothing, because applause happens in a room. But the files were everywhere. Trotsky was expelled from the Communist Party in November 1927. He was 58 years old. He had spent 30 years of his life building the organization that had just expelled him. He was sent first to Alma-Ata in what is now Kazakhstan, far from Moscow, far from allies, far from the levers of anything. He spent a year there, writing letters and waiting for something to change. Nothing changed. In 1929, Stalin had him expelled from the Soviet Union entirely. Trotsky went first to Turkey, to the island of Principe in the Sea of Marmara, where he lived in a house on the waterfront and wrote letters that he had no reliable way of knowing would reach their destinations. He spent 4 years there. The Turkish government tolerated his presence without warmth. His mail was monitored. His visitors were few. He kept writing anyway. From Turkey, he went to France, where he was watched by the French police and tolerated only as long as he stayed quiet about French politics. He did not stay quiet. He was asked to leave. He went to Norway, where the same pattern repeated. He was asked to leave Norway after the Soviet government threatened trade repercussions if Oslo continued to host him. He arrived in Mexico in January 1937. through the intervention of the painter Diego Rivera and his wife Frida Kahlo, who had offered him refuge in their blue house in Coyoacan. He lived there surrounded by high walls and bodyguards and the particular atmosphere of a man who knows he is being hunted and chooses to keep working anyway. From Coyoacan, he produced some of the most penetrating analyses of Stalinism ever written. His book, The Revolution Betrayed, published in 1936, is still read by historians. It described exactly what had happened to the Soviet state, how the bureaucracy had captured the revolution, how Stalin had made the apparatus serve his personal power. He was right about nearly all of it. It made no difference to anything. He was still writing in August 1940 when a man named Ramon Mercader, sent by Stalin, entered his study and killed him with an ice axe. He was 60 years old. Stalin was still in power. He would remain in power for another 13 years. What Stalin did with that power in the years between Trotsky's exile and his own death in 1953 is a matter of historical record. The Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 kills somewhere between 750,000 and 1.2 million people. The exact number is still debated. What is not debated is that it included most of the original Bolshevik leadership, the men who had made the revolution alongside Lenin, the men who had sat in those early meetings taking notes alongside Stalin. One by one, they were arrested, tried in show trials that were theatrical in their falseness, and executed. Many of them confessed to crimes they had not committed. The methods used to extract those confessions are documented. The forced collectivization of agriculture, carried out between 1929 and 1933, caused a famine that killed between 5 and 7 million people in Ukraine alone, a famine that was not accidental, that was caused by policies that continued even as people starved, that has been recognized by many nations as a genocide. The Gulag, the network of forced labor camps that stretched across Siberia and the Soviet Far East, held at its peak somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8 million people at any given time. Across the entire Stalinist period, it processed 18 million people. Millions did not come home. These are not disputed numbers, or not seriously. They come from Soviet archives, opened after 1991. They are what the paperwork says. The same paperwork system that Stalin had spent years learning to control. I want to go back to something small. In May 1924, when Lenin's testament was read to the Central Committee, the document that called for Stalin's removal, there was a moment, reported by several people who were present, when Stalin sat in his chair and looked at the floor. Just for a moment. A few seconds. And then he looked up, and his expression was unreadable, and the meeting continued. Nobody who was present that day reported understanding what he was thinking. Some of them would be dead within 15 years. I have thought about that moment many times. What was Stalin thinking in those few seconds with his eyes on the floor? Was he afraid? Was he calculating? Was he feeling something that might be called shame, or something that had no name? We do not know. We cannot know. He did not write it down, and if he had, we would have no way of trusting what he wrote. What we know is what he did next. He raised his head. He let others defend him. He watched the testament get buried. He went back to his office and back to his files and back to the quiet, patient work of building the system
that nobody was watching because it looked like paperwork. And then he used it. Leon Trotsky, in his last years in Mexico, wrote a biography of Stalin. It was unfinished when he died. In it, in the fragments that survive, he keeps returning to a question he could never fully answer. How did I miss it? Not how did Stalin do it? He understood that clearly by the end. The files, the appointments, the slow construction of obligation. He understood the mechanism. What he could never fully explain, even to himself, was how a man of his intelligence, his experience, his access, had watched it happen and not seen it in time to stop it. He had sat in the same rooms. He had seen the same meetings. He had access to the same information. He was smarter by almost any measure, more educated, more articulate, more respected internationally. And he lost. He wrote in one of the last pages of the unfinished manuscript, I underestimated him because I underestimated what the work looked like, the unimportant work, the work that nobody wants. That sentence was written in 1940 in Mexico City, a few weeks before Mercader came through the door. I do not know if Trotsky knew he was out of time. His bodyguards believed he sensed it. He had survived several previous attempts. He kept writing anyway. Joseph Stalin died on March 5, 1953, in his dacha outside Moscow. He was 74 years old. He had ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 30 years. The men around him, the men who had feared him, who had built their careers on reading him correctly, who had survived by never being in the wrong room at the wrong time, those men stood around his bed as he was dying and were afraid to call a doctor. Afraid that sending for help too quickly might look like eagerness for him to survive. Afraid that not sending for help quickly enough might look like something else. They had spent so many years calculating every action, every word, every expression for how it might be interpreted, that even at the moment of his death, they could not stop calculating. He had built a system that turned everyone around him into a permanent hostage to his interpretation. That was his real legacy. Not the speeches, not the ideology. The paperwork, the files, the knowledge of how a system works, applied with patience and without mercy over 30 years. In the great hall of the House of Unions in Moscow, where his body lay in state, hundreds of thousands of people came to pay their respects. The crowds were so large, the grief so apparently genuine, that people were crushed to death in the press. Some of them truly mourned. Some of them were afraid not to appear to mourn. Even in death, the files were watching. The man no one watched. That is what they called him in the early years. Not with those exact words, but that was the meaning. The man in the corner, the quiet one, the one who did the administrative work while others made speeches. He outlasted all of them. Not because he was the best, not because he was right. Because he understood that the work nobody wanted to do, the files, the names, the quiet decisions made in rooms where nobody important was watching, was the work that held everything together. And the person who holds everything together, eventually, holds everything. That is not an admirable truth. It is simply true. And the people who paid the price for that truth, in the Gulag, in the Ukrainian fields, in the basements of Lubyanka prison, in a study in Mexico City, They understood it in a way that history books rarely capture. Not as a lesson about power, as the thing that happened to them. Leon Trotsky had seen it coming at the end. He just ran out of time to finish writing it down.